Well, thank you for joining me again. We're going to continue our study in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 today. Once again, I hope everybody's doing well. As we come to chapter 10, once again, we're going to begin in verse 12. In verse 12, Paul says, "Take heed, therefore, a man who thinks he stand, lest he fall." So Paul just finished talking to them in the first 11 verses about the example of the Hebrews and how they failed. And how because of their lust for evil things, their participation in idolatry and sexual immorality. And Paul's been warning them, you're on the verge of the very same things that these Hebrews did. And you need to be careful about that. But in Corinth, keep in mind, they're lifted up with pride. They have this haughty spirit about them because of their gifts, because of their knowledge, because of their spiritual gifts, which we'll look at when we get to chapters 12 through 14. And Paul is saying you need to be careful about this. Don't just slough this off and say this is nothing. If you think you stand, take heed lest you fall. That's just a good general admonition overall. But here in context, it has to do with the idolatry that's being practiced at Corinth and all the things that go with the idolatry, the sexual immorality, and things like that. But not everybody in Corinth was that way. There were some who were not self-righteous. And so he talks about there's no temptation overtaking you, but such as is common to man. The idea of temptation there is not solicitation to sin, but testing. There's this testing going on. But he says it's such as is common to man. Every man, every individual, every person, mankind, faces a testing. But understand, God is faithful and will not allow you to be overcome. He'll provide a way of escape. Which tells us that when these tests of adversity come like this, God's not the author. God's not behind them. Our adversary is behind them. But God is faithful. You can depend upon God. So rather than depending upon yourself and putting confidence in yourself, you need to put confidence, have your confidence in God. And then you'll move to the point. In verse 14, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, flee idolatry." This is the point he's been building to. From the Hebrew example, now to this warning about take heed lest you fall. And then he says, here's the point. Flee idolatry. Obviously, idol worship was a significant part of the culture at Corinth. We talked before about how they had Venus, the goddess of love that was on the top of the mountain and the temple that was there. How idolatry and sexual immorality was a part of what their worship was. So there's something ingrained in the Corinthian culture that they're facing. And so he says, flee idolatry. And then he says, I'm going to talk to you like people who can understand logically what I'm saying. I'm going to give you credit for having sense to be able to reason and think about this. And so he's going to use the illustration of the Lord's table and the illustration of Israel as a nation to make his point. And so then he says, the cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The blood which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? Let me pause just there to give a parenthetical thought for just a moment. The cup of blessing, cup of thanksgiving, which we bless, which we bless. Notice that, which we bless. I'm not trying to sound really hypercritical at all, but just to ask you to think about this. When we come to the table, often it is, Lord, bless this bread or bless this cup. Well, the Lord has already blessed the bread and blessed the cup by the offering of Jesus. It's the cup of thanksgiving we bless, we eulogize, we say good things about. The idea of saying good things about is to tell the blessing and the benefit of what we have received. If someone gives you a gift or does something nice or good to you, and you tell someone else about it, let me tell you what so-and-so has done for me. And you begin to elucidate all the things that person's done. Let me tell you what they gave. Let me tell you about the gift they gave. And you tell people the blessing of the gift and the value it holds to you. That's eulogizing. Well, here Paul is saying, tell people about the meaning of the memorial of the bread. Tell people about the meaning of the memorial of the cup. That's what he means by we bless. We eulogize. We say good things about. We tell people what this means to us and the value is. And then he will say, Furthermore, in verse 17, for we, though many, are one bread and one body, all partakers of that one bread. And so when he talks about the partakers of the one bread, here we partake of, we share in. We become joint participants in what Christ has done. We share in what Christ has done. We enjoy the benefits of what Christ has done. We are fellows. We have fellowship with him in what he's done for us. Though many, we partake of this one bread. We receive the benefits of it. We share, we proclaim we're partakers of what Christ has done for us. And that's the key to the whole point he's going to make here about idols and eating meat sacrificed to idols and going in the idol's temple. He's going to say, just as when you partake of the bread, you become one with the Lord, so when you eat that which has been sacrificed to idols in the idol's temple, you become one with the idol. But more than that, become one with what's back of the idol. Just as you become one with what's back of the bread and the cup, the Lord. You become one with what's back of the bread of the idol in the idol's temple and the meat sacrificed to idols. You become one with that. You become a sharer and a partaker of that demonic force, that demonic being, Satan himself. The idol's nothing. He says, I'll say to you, the idol's nothing. It's just a figment of your imagination. It's something you cut out of stone, out of wood. It's not going to curse you. It's not going to bless you. But when you sit down at the idol's table, you go to the idol's temple, you partake of that which is sacrificed to idols, you become one. You share in, you partake of, you identify yourself with that idol. And he said, you can't have it both ways. You can't sit at the idol's table in the idol's temple and have fellowship with the idol and partake in the idol and share in what the idol is and the one back of it, the demonic forces back of it. Anymore, you can sit at the table at the same time. You can't have it sit at the table of the Lord and enjoy what's back of the blessings of the table, the Lord himself and the benefits of the Lord, at the same time you do idols. He says in verse 19, what am I saying then? That idol is anything, or what is offered is idol anything? Absolutely not. A rhetorical question. Rather, the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I do not want you to have fellowship with the demons. Back in verse 18, he says, observe Israel after the flesh. Are not those who eat of the sacrifice partakers of the altar? So here the meat would be brought to the altar, and to partake of the meat that's sacrificed at the altar is to say, God says, I approve this. I approve of the sacrifice that is being offered. Israel understood that. So to partake of the cup and the bread and the meat sacrificed at the altar to God is to have fellowship with God, to become one with God, is to have the approval of God. Not the idol anything, but that which is back of the idol. You can't also sit at the table of the idol and go to the idol's temple and partake of what is part of the idol and have fellowship with God at the same time. And here in Corinth, they're trying to do that. He says, flee idolatry. You lust after evil things. Flee sexual immorality. Flee idolatry. All those things are part of one another. Because when you participate in idolatry, you become one with the idol. I'm not saying the idol's a god, but that which is back of it, Satan himself. And so then he'll say, or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? Now you tie back in with the first 11 verses. Remember what he will say in verse 6. Now these things happen to our example, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as do they. Why? Because we're testing the Lord too. He says, don't test the Lord. Verse 9, nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted. So verse 22, or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? God says, I'm not going to share you. I'm not going to share you with the idol and the meat sacrificed to idol and that which is back of the idol. I'm not going to share you with idols and the idol sacrifices. Flee sexual immorality. And to partake of the idol and the meat sacrificed to the idol in the idol's temple and that which is back of the idol is to provoke the jealousy of God, because God says, I'm not going to share you. You're mine. If you're going to partake of my table, my bread, and my cup, then you are one with me. I'm not going to share you. You can't have it both ways. And then he comes to verse 23. Now, I think you have the libertine speaking here again. All things are lawful for me. Paul will say, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me. Paul will say, but not all things edify. That goes back to chapter 8. In chapter 8, they said, we have our knowledge. Paul said, yeah, but it's not just knowledge. It's a matter of your love for your brother, too. And there in chapter 8, he says, I'll not exercise my right to eat meat if it costs my brother his soul. Here they're saying we have the freedom to participate in idolatry. It's lawful. Paul said, yeah, but it's not helpful. We have the right to do that, but yeah, it's not edifying. Then he says, verse 24, that no one seek his own, but each one of the other's well-being. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no question for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord and all its fullness. So now then, in chapter 8, he was talking about, here's my brother that I might cause to sin, cause to stumble. But now he's talking about me. And here he says, eat the meat at the table. And don't ask questions for conscience sake. I wonder if sometimes we can be overly scrupulous about our lives. Become so self-analytical, so intense, so on the edge of things that we can't enjoy anything within the framework of being a Christian for fear of what someone may think or someone may say. So here you have in verse 25, 26, 27, 28. Here's the dinner party. A private issue. It moves from a private issue of the market to a more public issue of a dinner party involving other people. Therefore, other consciences are involved. Therefore, it makes it more complicated. So he'll say in verse 27, if any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner, you desire to go, eat whatever is set before you, asking no question for conscience sake. That's what he says in verse 25. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake. Don't be overly scrupulous about it. Would an unbeliever be concerned about what they bought at the meat market? And whether they've been sacrificed to an idol or not? An unbeliever's not concerned about that. An unbeliever's not going to be overly scrupulous about that. And so he says, here, eat. Don't be overly scrupulous about it. Don't be overly concerned about it. Eat. The idol's nothing. The meat's nothing. And then we'll say, verse 28, but if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat for the sake of one who told you, and for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord in all its fullness. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? So Paul is saying here, on one hand, you have the unbeliever who invites you to his house to eat, and you have meat. He said, don't ask if this is bought in the meat market or not, if this has been sacrificed to idols or not. The unbeliever's not going to be concerned about that. But here's someone that is a brother who's weak. This is not talking about the pagans. Not talking about some pagan out here sees me do this. You're not talking about somebody outside of Christ that sees me do this. Here's somebody we'd say in the world that sees me do this. That's not what he's talking about here. Paul's not concerned about someone in the world or some pagan out here. Paul's concerned about this weak brother. And so he says, if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat for the sake of the one who told you, for the sake of your weak brother. Here's the weak brother that's also a guest. He knows this meat was bought at the meat market that had been sacrificed to idols. And he says, whoa, wait a minute here. Do you know what you're doing? You don't be overly scrupulous. But if your brother says, wait a minute, are you sure you can eat that? He's calling it to his attention. The origin of that meat served at the meal was for the idol itself. And here Paul says the strong Christian is advised not to eat. The liberty lies in the fact they may or may not eat. Not in the sense that they may do as they please, eat or not, without reason or for wrong or foolish reason. Their liberty lies in the ability to choose between eating and not eating with entire freedom, as long as they're guided by both true knowledge and true love. So knowledge and love will not prevent me, will not allow me to eat this meat and cause my brother's soul. But he says, verse 30, if I partake, verse 29, conscience I say not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? If I partake with thanks, am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? And so here he begins to talk about the fact that here it's been received with thanksgiving. To me, it's nothing. Am I being judged because I partake of it that way? Let me just kind of offer this illustration for you. Imagine you're an active member of the church at Corinth. You're very involved and very respected. You've even been invited to a patio party at R&J Chariot Shop on Colosseum Way. They've also invited a young man named Erastus, who, unknown to them, has recently come to know the Lord and become a member of the church you attend. You all sit down. The meal is served. Enjoying your Caesar salad, you look across the table, and the meal is served. You look across the table and see a familiar face. Eating your Caesar salad, you look across the table and see a familiar face, Erastus, the new believer who's been attending where you do. You smile and chat a little. Then your attention is diverted by the delicious smelling entree, sirloin steak, delicately seasoned, cooked to perfection. Just as you're reaching for your fork, Erastus leans over to you and whispers, "I've heard the cooks talking about how they were glad so much meat was left over after the sacrifice. You know, that bothers me because I was involved in idol worship for a long time. I just don't feel right about eating this meat." Question: what do you do? Well, mustering all resistance, you leave the meat on your plate and politely say, "Pass the grapes, pass the roll, and pass the broccoli. Skip the meat." The time may come in which Erastus may learn really the meat is nothing. Eating the meat is nothing. But at this point, he's saying that is a problem for me. And Paul is saying in this instance then, back to verse 24, let no one seek his own, but each other, but all others' well-being. Verse 31 then, he says, therefore, whatever you eat or drink, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Is it to the glory of God to cause my brother to stumble? Is it the glory of God to take advantage of my liberty because I can do this and say, well, that's just tough for you. You'll have to get over that. Again, we're not talking about some pagan out here. We're talking about a weak brother. He says, verse 32, just give no offense, either to Jews or Greeks or to the church of God. Just as also please men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. The same thing he said back in chapter 9. To the Jew I became a Jew, to the Gentile I became a Gentile. He said, I'm not going to take advantage of my liberty just because I have the liberty to do that, to cause another man to stumble, to cause another man to sin. Just also as I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, not taking advantage of my liberties, but the profit of many. Why? That all may be saved. I think what you have here are some timeless principles about liberty. I think you have, number one, the profit principle. Liberty is not to be exercised at the expense of other souls. Verses 22 and 23, it's not for their profit. Then I think what you have also is the people principle. I think you have that in verses 24 and verse 33. Look out for the concern of others and do what is best for others. He tells the Corinthians in the tersiest manner what they're to do when they're following their promptings of love. Don't seek your own, but be considerate of the other. Exclude all selfishness. And then he says in verse 29, as for your conscience is concerned. It make no difference as to the nature of the meat you could eat, but for the sake of the weak brother and disturbing scruples, refrain from eating. Curtail your liberty for the other man's conscience. There's the people principle. My own freedom of conscience is not subject to the ignorance and weakness of some other individual. He cannot arrogate to himself the right to sit in judgment on my liberty and order me to do what his conscience considers right and for me to do what his conscience considers wrong. But in regard to this meat, my conscience is wholly free to eat as I desire. In fact, my conscience would not all raise the question whether this meat is sacrificed to idols or not. It's not at all my conscience, but altogether the other person of which I have regard. So he says, I'll not eat the meat. And then you have verse 26, what I call the planet principle. Verse 26, why do you inquire closer to this matter? The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. That includes all the food. Buying food for our table is an entirely different matter than dining at a feast, giving it honor at an idol. This belongs to the Lord. All belongs to the Lord who created it. Not a demon, not an idol. And then he says, verse 31, the primary principle. He says, therefore, whatever you eat or drink, do all to the glory of God. That's the bottom line. The bottom line is, I do all to the glory of God. Well, thanks for joining me for this latter part of chapter 10, and I hope this is beneficial for you. Certainly a lot to think about. Look forward to being with you next time as we begin chapter 11. Thank you.